22 and 23. So, Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I would move that the committee approve the minutes as presented for January 14, 16, 21, 22, and 23 of 2025.
Thank you.
I'll second, Mr. Chairman. Clifford seconds. Aye.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, thank you very much for having me. I'll wait for the slides to come up and we'll get going. I provided you all with a white folder, and the slide pack is in that folder, so we'll try to keep along. I tend to do a lot of animations, but I'll try to keep everybody on track, and then we'll track them up here, of course. So my name is Jake Kalbus. I'm the director of the Kansas Geological Survey, and I also serve as the geologist, the state geologist for the state of Kansas. And the fun thing is explaining to people why the state geologist is going to talk to them about hydrogen. And if I'm successful, you'll all have perfect clarity at the end of 25 minutes or so on why that is. I'm just going to animate through. There we go. First, a word about what the Kansas Geological Survey is to kind of paint a picture and a framework. So the Kansas Geological Survey's mission is really to advance science and to serve Kansas. It's both for us, and we have a service mission. We provide a tremendous amount of service work in the state of Kansas, but we also have a scientific mission to bring and bridge technologies into the state and to advance new technologies here. Really, 3 bullets on the left-hand side of this introductory page. You know, it's all about bringing objective scientific information, authoritative information, and information that speaks to each other, so interoperable information. So in other words, we need our geological data to match and to speak to our water data, and we need it to speak to our energy data, and we need it to all be interoperable together, and that's what interoperability is about. It's to conduct new research and to bring impactful technologies into the state. And then finally, it's to provide decision support mechanisms and decision support systems for all of you decision makers. So we go up and we basically provide the options that are out there so that decision makers like yourselves can make the right decisions. On the right-hand side, I've got some merit badges, and it just kind of is there to show you the different divisions of the Kansas Geological Survey. So water resources and health. We do energy and critical minerals, both of which I'll be talking about today. Archives and libraries are really sort of the glue that brings it all together. So we have, you know, an incredible amount of subsurface data in the state of Kansas to bear, and that becomes important for what we'll talk about too. Hazards and safety, so that's geophysical hazards, things like sinkholes and mine collapse hazards. And then we have a small army of information technology specialists and application developers that help us, again, to glue all of that information together into data systems. This slide then brings together what we're going to talk about today. And really, it's going to be one subset of energy that I think is an option and is going to be important for the state of Kansas, hydrogen specifically. It also has to bear on water resources in the state, though. Hydrogen goes hand in hand with water in many ways. And so I'll bridge into the next piece and kind of take you through what hydrogen is in the state. There's a little bit of a delay, so the slides will be delayed, but we should be looking now at this bubble here, this blue bubble of hydrogen. So we're going to all be hearing a lot about hydrogen. I think it's been a topic for a couple of years now that many have heard about and talked about. And there are focal points in the state of Kansas specifically that I want you all to be aware of. So hydrogen traditionally, and now we're going to flip the page and you'll see a little animation come up here. So hydrogen is used throughout the United States. It's used throughout the world very commonly for a range of different processes, and I'll tell you about those. It is generated right now almost exclusively from fossil fuels. It's generated from methane through a process called steam methane reforming. So you take steam up to a very high temperature, you combine it with methane, it breaks apart hydrogen from the carbon molecules. Carbon molecules go out as CO2, it's usually vented. And then we capture the hydrogen, and it's used for a range of different offtake mechanisms. So first one, and I'm going to kind of go through the hydrogen utilization here on the right. So you'll see fuels. So this is things like aviation fuels, things like electrical generation. So you can make hydrogen. It becomes a very high heat source for running internal combustion engines. A good example for an internal combustion engine that will be very soon starting to use hydrogen for that, again, sort of combustion, primary combustion, is aircraft engines. So this is a new application using hydrogen blended either with diesel fuels or hydrogen tanks themselves on aircraft engines for combustion. And so Airbus has announced that they plan to do an A380 demo by the end of 2026. So they'll be flying their large jetliner with hydrogen fuels. So you can take hydrogen, and one of the primary offtakes is combustion. I'll flip pages again. Fuel cells is another primary use for hydrogen. So a fuel cell, the way I like to think of it, is effectively like a reverse battery. So you're sending hydrogen ions through a cathode-anode pair with a catalyst. Out the back end of that, you get two things. You get electricity and you get water. So you're basically recombining hydrogen into oxygen and you get water back out of it, but at the same time, you're generating electricity. Now, fuel cells are important because they're going to go into several different sectors. Number one is stationary manufacturing. So you can use fuel cells. I'll give one of my favorite examples is Panasonic. Panasonic's Kyoto battery factory is run exclusively on hydrogen fuel cells, something on the order of 95 fuel cells. They truck hydrogen in, and they basically run those reverse batteries off of hydrogen fuel. We'd like to see, if they do a phase 2 for this Panasonic plant here, perhaps that's a pathway that they would choose to move into. Fuel cells are also important for transportation, especially heavy transportation. So think 18-wheelers, think municipal bus transit. The reason for that is that they're much, much lighter than batteries, and they're much less expensive. Fuel cells are much less expensive than batteries. So you can put them onto an 18-wheeler, and you're not taking the weight capacity, the overall storage capacity of the 18-wheeler itself, you're not diminishing that down. You're using, hydrogen fuel in the gaseous form in a tank, very much like a gasoline tank or a diesel tank. So hydrogen, we think, is going to be an important way nationally to help diversify our fueling fleet for heavy truck and municipal transport. The other one is municipal transport, so think busing fleets, okay? Yes, they can do busing fleets on diesel. That's what we do primarily now. You can do it on natural gas. You can do it on electric. But hydrogen is a new pathway, is another pathway that seems promising. I'll also bring up statewide transport. So this is a zoom in of our region. And what this is doing, sort of the things that look like arteries on this are just that. They're the major transportation arteries of I-35 going north-south and I-70 going east-west. So we have an enormous amount of freight, an enormous number of large FAF trucks, 18-wheelers, coming through our region. One of the chicken and egg problems associated with diversifying the nationwide 18-wheeler fleet is the problem of, you're not going to build the trucks if you don't have the fueling stations, and you're not going to build the fueling stations if you don't have the trucks. So which one comes first? We thought a lot about this, and I think the way that this is going to happen is that hydrogen fueling is basically going to seat in major metropolitan areas serving those bus fleets. And then that becomes an artery network of fueling stations that FAF trucks, that these large-scale trucks can access as they go coast to coast, either east-west or north-south. So this map becomes pretty important because the I-70 corridor, when you think of the state of Kansas, we're it between Denver, St. Louis, Chicago, Dallas. we become the Kansas City area, and then along our interstates through Salina and west, become it with respect to nascent fueling opportunities. So that's something to watch for and think about. I'm going to kind of keep going. Oh, by the way, this diagram that I'm filling out is something that I made. It's called the Swiss Army knife of hydrogen. So it's worth spending some time on, because hopefully by the end of it, it provides a roadmap of what we think potentially could happen. Hydrogen is important for chemicals and refining. I've been surprised as I've investigated hydrogen. And by the way, why did I investigate hydrogen? I was lead on a project 2 years ago to take Kansas into what were called the DOE's hydrogen hubs, the Clean Hydrogen Hubs initiative. And so that was an initiative to bring $1 billion of federal grant money here to the state of Kansas, and then to add on to that with several more $1 billion of private investment to do hydrogen in the state for a couple of good reasons. So I led that, and through that effort, through that research, and through the work that we did with the Department of Energy, that sort of was my lead into hydrogen. In that effort, I'll say that chemicals and refining was a surprisingly interesting part of the hydrogen story. Multiple companies came to us, multiple major refiners in the state of Kansas came to us and said, we want to do something to diversify our intake of hydrogen into our refining facilities. They use hydrogen to strip sulfur out of the refined products, going from crude into refined products. And so they wanted to find a way to diversify that and to lower their carbon footprint, lower their emissions of CO2. And they saw this as a really important way to do that. So that's part of the chemicals and refining piece. There's also a link of hydrogen into methane genesis that can be important for our ethanol farmers. Ammonia fertilizers is the next one. And I think you're on page 11 now in your pack. Ammonia fertilizers, so hydrogen is a primary input into anhydrous ammonia, which is NH3. So you combine nitrogen molecules from the air with hydrogen molecules through a process called Haber-Bosch, and you get anhydrous ammonia. Of course, ammonia is an incredibly important product in our agricultural community here. I've got a map on the next page. Just going to wait for there you go. I've got a map here that just shows corn for grain. In the background, that's the colors on this map. Again, same footprint of the region, focusing in on Kansas. And then what I'm showing in the big black lines and the stippled line is the pipeline-based ammonia transport through our region. And the thing that's important to note is that the Magellan pipeline that used to bring anhydrous ammonia into the region had to go out of commission, so it just aged out. So from an infrastructure perspective, we're pretty far at the distal end of ammonia distribution. Hydrogen presents an opportunity for ammonia producers to diversify sort of the way that they're getting hydrogen, and then to use that for not only local use, but also potentially to become a net exporter of anhydrous ammonia out of the region. The final one, and I'm not going to talk much about this one, but the final one is for concrete production and metals. So hydrogen is particularly hot burning, and so you can use that in the concrete manufacturing process. And again, you're reducing the amount of atmospheric CO2 that you're emitting. That's a farther one off. It's a little bit more difficult. You know, concrete production is a low margins business, but we think that nationally, certainly, and potentially regionally, hydrogen development can be important for the concrete manufacturing process. So that's hopefully painting the picture of hydrogen utilization. But now I want to move back to the left on this roadmap or this diagram and talk more about hydrogen production. Okay, so I'm on slide 14 in your pack. And I mentioned first off that fossil fuel generation, steam methane reforming, is the way that we right now generate hydrogen. If you combine that steam methane reforming with carbon capture, so if you capture the CO2 at the point source and then sequester it, then you may have heard the term gray hydrogen or blue hydrogen, then it becomes blue hydrogen in the parlance of the Department of Energy. So if you capture it and sequester the CO2, you're reducing the amount of CO2 ultimately that would be produced. Slide 15 is a busy diagram, but what I want to make the point of here is this is new work, new research from the Geological Survey. And what we've done is we've made a risk map to showcase the chance of adequacy in different counties around the state of Kansas based on geology alone, based on the subsurface characteristics of being able to store CO2. And we can actually develop histogram diagrams to show which counties we think will be better from a chance of adequacy to store CO2 relative to those that might present more risk to store CO2. If we choose to do it, the state of Kansas can become a CO2 storage state. In our calculations, we've done something on a hypothetical of about 50 gigatons of CO2 storage capacity in 3 counties alone. So really, hypothetically, theoretically, we can store a massive amount of CO2. Now, we have to work a whole bunch of the supply chain side of that out, but it is theoretically possible based on our geology if we choose to do it. And that's what these maps and graphs show. I want to talk now, I'm on slide 16, and what we've done is we've gone from steam methane reforming and blue hydrogen, and now I want to talk for a minute about electrolysis. Now, electrolysis is an experiment that you would have done in high school chemistry or college chemistry, where you take, very simply, a current of electricity, you run it into water with 2 little barbs coming out. One barb will produce oxygen that's vented into the atmosphere. The other barb of that electrolysis reaction will produce hydrogen. And so you can store the hydrogen, you can use it. We do effectively the same thing, but the advantage for us on the industrial scale is that you have many different options for how you generate the electricity. So for example, in the state of Kansas, if you want to do it from wind, you can tie wind energy or solar energy, or better, both wind and solar, in to produce that electrolysis reaction at a very large scale. You can also tie things like nuclear energy. You can also tie conventional energy from gas plants, gas turbine plants, or coal-fired power plants. When you do that, when you combine that electricity with a sustainable source of water, then you can generate that electrolysis reaction. You can drive that forward and you can generate hydrogen gas, and you can move it to the right in that diagram. Okay. And that presents a bunch of opportunities, especially when you combine it with storage, which I'll talk about in a minute. So now we've got sort of 2 good ways to produce hydrogen: steam methane reforming. We've got electrolysis reactions. Now, I want to make a point about the energy landscape in the state of Kansas. This is on slide number 17, and it's a busy map, but it shows all of the electrical generation pathways nationwide, zooming in on the state of Kansas. The point that I want to make here, and the colors, by the way, on this represent the different pathways for producing electricity. So you've got gray is coal-fired power, red on this map is gas-fired power, and then greens and blues are hydroelectric and wind. And the point that I want to make on this, if you switch over to slide 18, is that about 60%, a little over 60% of our electricity in the country is made from fossil sources, so from gas and from coal-fired power. About 25% of that is coal generation. And if you flip over to slide 18, I've now stripped away, oops, let me go back. Yeah, this map here, so showing the reds and the grays. What I've done now is I've stripped away all other electrical generation, and we're focusing on just the coal-fired power and gas. And the point that I want to make is that we're at the very western edge of a belt of energy generation that is coal-fired power dominated, and then with subsidiary gas-fired power. Okay, so that's part of the look, and it goes through sort of central Pennsylvania, essentially, with that pattern. We're substantially different from some of our competitors in Chicago. We're different from Indianapolis, Indiana. We're different from Oklahoma City. We're different, certainly, from Denver, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and the eastern coast of the United States. And the thing that's different is that in our major metropolitan areas, we're still on fossil fuel. We're still on predominantly coal-fired power. One of the challenges is on the next map. And what I'll show you is an animation of that map. Actually, I'm going to skip this guy, and I'm going to move right to slide number 20. That same map again, but now what I'm highlighting is the belt where we're developing wind generation. So your map should look like this with a bunch of green dots. And that shows where in the United States we have considerable amount of wind generation. And the reason for that, the reason for those wind farms is that we have very high sustained wind speeds in the Great Plains. That happens because the Rocky Mountains, you have advection coming off of the Rocky Mountains, and it drives high sustained wind velocities across our territory. The real challenge is transmission constraints. So how do you get the wind out of that area and into manufacturing centers, for example? So how do you export that to places where you can best utilize it? And number two is the intermittency itself, so the wind predominantly blowing at night. I think that hydrogen presents a potential way that we can start to unlock some of that latent potential. And it really comes through a couple of things. I'm gonna pause. I will come back to the slide on water if there are questions, but for the sake of time, I want to move through it. The point on this, and I'm very happy to kind of illustrate this, is that throughout our state, we have figured out equations where we can do water for the process of generating hydrogen, and we can do it sustainably. So there are industrial processes that we can link in with our knowledge of the subsurface, our knowledge of the High Plains Aquifer, the Ogallala Aquifer, where we can sustainably generate hydrogen and actually put water back into the aquifer. So there are some ways to do that, and during Q&A, I'd be very happy to talk about that. But I want to make this link with electrolysis, and it's effectively this idea that when we can generate hydrogen from electrolysis, generate hydrogen through steam methane reforming, and generate hydrogen through a third mechanism, which would be geological hydrogen. This is very new. I'm going to try to get you caught up in slides here. Yeah, there you go. So now I'm looking at slide number 23. And on slide 23, what I've added here are geological sources of hydrogen. I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but this is new technology that is very much the focus of the military, very much the focus of the Department of Energy, and very much the focus of the USGS. And it's effectively generating hydrogen from geological sources, so deep crustal rocks that naturally generate hydrogen that naturally comes up through the subsurface. The other opportunity with geologic hydrogen is to actually drill wells, very much like oil and gas wells, into these deep crustal rocks and inject hot water. When you do that, you naturally go through mineralogical reactions that produce hydrogen. I'm showing a simulation of one of those that one of our scientists has been driving forward for the past several months. And it shows you can have two wells in our rocks in the subsurface and generate hydrogen actively. If you do that, it's going to be expensive on the front end, but you effectively will create a hydrogen generator that we can utilize. So again, the military, the Department of Energy, and the USGS are very, very interested in this source of hydrogen. And that effectively makes a third for us in our region. And I'll say, northeastern Kansas and western Iowa and southeastern Nebraska are areas of focus because of the bedrock geology there. There's a rift that started to happen 1 billion years ago. That rift stopped, but what it did was effectively bring just the right kinds of rocks relatively shallow into the subsurface that allow us to access and drive these reactions forward. This is new stuff, lots of work to be doing, but you're going to hear a lot of discussion about hydrogen companies coming into the state. There are many active leases out, and there are active plans for them to be doing drilling activities. The last thing that I want to link here, and it really closes out the Swiss Army knife for hydrogen, is the key part for us, and it's a part that is really unique to the state of Kansas. And what I've done now, when you go to slide number, I believe that's slide number 26, there's one last element that I've added into the hydrogen Swiss Army knife, and it's just to the right of the hydrogen bubble, and it just says geologic storage. We have ace up our sleeve in the state of Kansas, and it is our bedded salt. So bedded salt exists in our state from central Kansas all the way to the western border and beyond the western border into Colorado, and it extends down into Oklahoma. Salt is an almost perfect storage medium for hydrogen. Hydrogen's a small molecule, and it's a gas, right? So we store it as a gas. But salt is an almost perfect storage medium because it has extremely low porosity and permeability. We've been storing natural gas and liquids in it for decades. So what you do is you drill a well, you cycle water, you form out a storage void, and then you can put gaseous hydrogen into that storage void. They've been doing this in Europe for decades. The advantage for us is that that salt underlies so much of our state, and it's relatively thick and it's relatively pure. Now, we have work to do in this space, but we've said before that one way to make hydrogen very economically attractive is to store that hydrogen in the subsurface. Compared to surficial storage, so compared to storing it in steel tanks, which is actually technically difficult to do and expensive, you have an order of magnitude better cost advantage for storing hydrogen in the subsurface. So I can see in the future where Kansas could actually become a central storage hub for regional hydrogen production and potentially a national reserve for hydrogen. So that storage element really completes out this equation of multiple pathways for hydrogen production, multiple pathways for hydrogen utilization, and then the need to be able to balance supply and demand. I'm going to skip over the geology, and it pains me to do that as a geologist, but I do want to make sure that I close out for you. So in summary, and this is really the last slide, I think that hydrogen energy is going to present opportunities for the state of Kansas. We can see it coming from multiple different edges in private industry. I think that Kansas has an advantage over many, if not most, if not all, of the states in the United States where it comes to hydrogen production through multiple pathways, through storage, through multiple pathways, and then through utilization. And I think that that equation, that complete equation, could present economic opportunities for our state. The initial pathways that I think you're likely to see are applications in municipal transportation. I think you're likely to see applications in military, garrison operations. I spoke to the Governor's Military Council in December. There was a lot of interest from Riley, Leavenworth, and McConnell. And I think that we're going to see it in industrial utilization, places like Panasonic and others. I also think that done right, hydrogen can be something that actually attracts people to the region, new industries to the region. With that, I think I'm right at my time, so I'll stand for questions if there's time.
Thank you, Doctor. Great presentation. Senator Clays.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Doctor, for coming today. I was wondering if you can speak briefly on safety, particularly as it relates to the CO2 storage. I'm sure you're familiar with Lake Nyos, I believe is Maroon, where there's a volcanic lake that burped up a bunch of CO2 and killed everybody in the villages nearby. Of course, that happened in the light of history where we were able to document that, but that's actually been used as an example of where some of these mysterious, small villages 500 years ago, suddenly somebody comes upon them and everyone's dead and they happen to be next to a volcanic lake. CO2 being heavier than air, obviously that creates a problem if it does escape. Can you just speak to that since, that does seem to be a great economic opportunity, but I'd sure hate for that to end up in a disaster.
Absolutely. No, it's a very good question and a very relevant one. So when we're talking about CO2 in the subsurface, part of what we did in our risk portfolio, that series of maps that stacked up to give us a chance of adequacy, a big part of that is not only do you have good seal adequacy, and I'm kind of speaking in terms of oil and gas seal, so the seals that go above hydrocarbon reservoirs. Not only do you have good seal, but do you have multiple good seals. You have to have effectively structural closure, and you have to have structural seal above those storage voids. And you've got to be able to prove that adequately before you're injecting any CO2. So there's a long safety and hazard assessment period that goes into the permitting process that's governed by the federal EPA. So that permitting process takes several years, and it takes multiple different penetrations in the subsurface where you're actually evaluating the seal adequacy as one of the key risks. Ultimately, what you're trying to move toward is you want to store CO2 not as a gas, but you want to inject it as a gas or a supercritical fluid, something between a gas and a liquid, and then you want to lock it away as mineral. So you want that CO2 to change to calcite and other carbonate minerals as soon as possible within years, not tens of years, but within years, so that you're effectively locking it in the geologic formation. When we can do that, then it can be quite safe. When you think it's going to stay in a gaseous form, we store gases in the subsurface all the time, but you have to go through those extra measures to ensure that you're very deep and that you're well sealed so that never makes it back to the surface.
Senator Clifford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Doctor. We seem to have a lot of geologic advantages, but I know when the federal government rolled out their hydrogen hub, we failed to make the final cut. So what were we lacking at that time? Thank you.
That's a huge question. I think some of what we were lacking, and let me explain. We went through, we punched way above our weight in the hydrogen hub effort. So we went all the way to from 78 initial applicants all the way down to the last 10. We went through a day of grueling interviews at the Department of Energy in DC, and we were named an alternate for funding. So we were named an alternate for $1 billion of federal capital, and then ultimately it was going to be a project of around $2.5 billion. I think what we lacked, and this is conjecture, we know that our application, which was several hundred pages of techno-economic evaluation, we know that it was a very well-received, technically rigorous and attractive bid. I think part of what we lacked is, and this is conjecture, but I think we weren't on the coast. I think we might not have had the political base. I also would say that many of the other hydrogen hubs, all of the other hydrogen hubs that were successful in getting funding, had several millions of dollars in the application process itself, and that money, in a way, walked a walk for them, we think. We know that we were compliant. We know that we had an attractive bid, and we know that we were right at the feather edge. And so it's hard to say exactly what would have pushed us over the edge.
Last question, then we'll have to move on. Senator Bowser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Kelbis, for your presentation. I flunked chemistry and geology, by the way, but it was a very good presentation. I'm trying to read slide 15 here. These 3 counties that have 50 gigatons of storage, is that in the northeast section of Kansas?
We actually, the ones that we think have the best pound for pound geological attributes for storage, they actually are 3 that kind of rim the southern part of the state.
Kind of the purple.
It's the kind of purple ones, exactly.
Second question is, I guess what would be the time frame then? And then maybe a third question is, what are we sort of doing to exploit this hydrogen opportunity? Thank you very much.
Right. So, and just to clarify, are you thinking of the time frame for CO2 or the time frame for hydrogen, or maybe both? Yeah. I think the challenges in CO2 are, it is a very arduous process. It costs, several $1 million for a company to go in and do a Class 6 well permit. It takes time. It takes a lot of rigorous subsurface activity. And yet we see many firms kind of moving forward and doing this around the country. I will say it is extremely technically rigorous. One of the things that makes it attractive is the 45Q tax credit. That incentivizes that storage on a per ton basis in the subsurface. So I think if that tax credit stays in place and continues to incentivize companies to store CO2 in the subsurface, we'll continue to see that snowball starting to pick up speed. With respect to the state of Kansas, again, the way that we're looking at it from the survey's perspective is to say we tend to go right to an area specific, a small area, and start doing analysis. And I think that that has its place, but we also think that we need to start statewide and say, look, from a big picture perspective, where do we think we have a play map, and then how do you zero in? Hydrogen, I think we're close. I think that we're close. I know that there are companies both on geologic hydrogen as well as electrolysis who are here working, and I think it's about marrying the offtake opportunities, the market opportunities with this phenomenal resources that we have.
Okay, Doctor, thank you for being here. We can talk for a week on this. We got another subject coming up. We could talk for another week on this. So next presentation will be small-scale nuclear reactors. It's Brian Meadows. He's the Chief Counsel for Excel Services. Brian, welcome to committee.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Senators. I appreciate y'all having me and look forward to talking with you. My name is Brian Meadows. I'm with Excel Services Corporation. I'm their General Counsel. About me briefly, I grew up not too far away from here in Arkansas. Got my nuclear engineering degree. Went to the Navy. I was a naval officer on nuclear submarines. Then I went to law school. And so I have those three things in my background: lawyer, professional engineer, have my license, and former nuclear submarine officer. And in the nuclear industry, I have found that to be a very good combination. At Excel Services, which one do I hit, the forward arrow? Yes. Excel Services has been around for 40 years. We've had every nuclear operator as a client. We've had more than 30 countries, either their nuclear operator or their ministries, as clients as well. And we are at the forefront in assisting startup companies as well as established companies in moving forward with new nuclear. The early site permits, the combined license applications, the construction permits, feasibility studies, development, siting, and so forth. We're part of all of that. I want to talk very briefly about nuclear power. Nuclear power's power density is greater than that of any other source. If I take a pellet of uranium, and this one's actually a little bit this thing is a little bit larger than what the normal pellet is, this is the equivalent of 1 ton of coal. That's the kind of density that we have. So that means that the amount of fuel that we need is a lot less, and the amount of waste that is generated is substantially less than any other chemical process, because it's not a chemical process, it's a nuclear process. 1 pellet equals 3 barrels of oil, 1 ton of coal, or 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas. Once built, nuclear is cheap and reliable. It is hard to put a number on nuclear, and I wanted to give a balanced presentation about the cost of nuclear. Nuclear is a generational asset. It can last for up to 80 years, and that may well extend beyond that. So once built, it's essentially a money machine because the cost to dispatch it 24/7, even if it's dark, even if there's no wind, the cost to dispatch it is relatively low. So one of the tricks about new nuclear is figuring out how to handle that initial capital cost. But those companies that have established nuclear, those keep producing and those do well. Historically, we think of existing nuclear as this: the cooling towers, the large cooling towers, perhaps the dome of containment, and that's the existing fleet now. Those days have changed. We are now into an arena of small modular reactors in which they can fit on, say, 40 acres as the entire emergency planning zone and fit into a small building like that, and that's a 300 megawatt plant. Those types of plants are being built now in Canada at the Bruce Power site. The new plants are, the existing fleet as it is now is incredibly safe, and when I talk about safety, I always want to compare it to other industrial activities, okay? It's safer than farming, it's safer than driving, it's safer than running a coal plant, it's certainly safer than being in a coal mine, safer than doing gas, all those things. Nuclear is safer than all these other industrial activities. So I'm happy to talk about safety, but please know I'm going to compare it to everything else that human beings do. The new plants that are coming up are even safer than that. They are walk-away safe. And in fact, the training, one of the jokes that we had at one of the vendors I used to work for was, just don't do something, stand there. Like, don't do anything. Let the plant go to its natural, stable state, and it will inherently go to the stable state. They are walk-away safe. Microreactors are also there. The thing that fits on the back of that semi, that's 20 megawatts. That could power about half a Salina. I believe that the microreactors, and this is just my opinion, are going to surprise us with how popular they become once those factories get up and start moving along. Because what you don't need with a microreactor is a whole bunch of additional transmission lines. I can park it into a factory or a college or a hospital or some small town, and it's just going to power it, and we can put it on the retail distribution lines. These things are also walk-away safe. There's now a perfect storm for nuclear power. It's happened all very recently. The amount of activity I've seen in the last year, year and a half is remarkable. The advent of artificial intelligence, Senator Francisco's electric vehicle, the need for all of this additional power. I remember you from the last committee hearing, and I made a note of that, Senator. These other industries need electricity. There are a lot of governments and corporations who are also demanding carbon-free power. This meets that need as well. They also promote national security and energy independence. And we see this with the war in Ukraine, with the Russians threatening to shut off natural gas to Western Europe. Nuclear prevents that kind of problem. You have your power right there. Also, they have a much smaller footprint, like about 30 times less than a lot of the renewables, than the wind and solar. And also, they contribute to grid stability because, again, they're always on, and the new plants can load follow. They can go up and down in their loads as needed. Of all the various forms of energy, only nuclear solves these problems, being carbon-free, dispatchable 24/7, small footprint. What's also new about the new nuclear is that it's no longer the case where the utility decides to build it and then just passes on the cost to the ratepayers. Private industry is getting into the game. Microsoft, Google, Dow Chemical down in Texas, Amazon also bought in to X-Energy, a reactor vendor. Private industry wants nuclear to power their data centers and, for example, let's say with Nucor Steel, which has expressed an interest for the process heat. I was going to say doctor and then say his last name, but I only know him as Jay. Jay, I need to learn your last name. Jay and I were talking earlier about hydrogen production. The process heat that comes off of nuclear could contribute strongly to a hydrogen production plant, depending on the method used. Okay, there are states currently taking actions for nuclear now. There's some that are exploring it with working groups, studies, and so forth. There are others that are recognizing nuclear energy as a clean source, which is entirely appropriate. There are others that are removing barriers and signaling support, and there's also those who are starting to work on their supply chain. I included, not in the slides, there's a second packet of materials. I included an excerpt from a Texas study that shows the different things that governments can do. And I also included a 31-page document from NEI, which is the industry group, that did a survey of the different states' laws on nuclear. And so for more detail, I would take a look at that much thicker packet that I have. I think it's something on the order of 47, 48 pages. And with that, I will pause for, I think that's all. I'll pause for questions. Is that all, Braden? Am I all done? I'm done, okay. Happy to take questions. I'm passionate about this stuff.
Thank you. I knew Senator Francisco would have one here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was particularly interested when you talked about the ability now of nuclear power to be moved up and down in terms of demand, because certainly
Yes.
one thing we've seen from Wolf Creek is that if it's running, you need to keep
Right.
running.
So the economics, there's two things that favor the current plants being at the same power all the time. One is the economics, the way that the reactor physics works and so forth. They can do the calculations better and squeeze more power out of each fuel core. But the second reason is that because of the lower enrichment levels, I'm not going to try to, there's a lot of reactor physics behind what I'm saying, but because of the lower enrichment levels, if you have wild swings in power, at some point you'll get to what's called being xenon precluded, and it would stop the reactor from being able to swing back up in power. The Navy reactors avoid this problem for classified, but for the commercial plants, that's a problem. So for the new load following items, there are slightly higher enrichments. It's called HALEU, high assay, low enriched uranium, which gives a little bit more flexibility in the power swings. But if I need to lower power rapidly, some of the designs just have a steam dump where they'll just, frankly, just waste the heat. But that's okay because we need to lower it down, and then you can ramp up fairly quickly. I hope that, was that responsive to the answer? Okay.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Senator Clays?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for coming today. Your title of a nuclear lawyer, I'm very impressed with. That's pretty awesome. So my question is, and I'm going to channel my friend over here who's a car dealer, what's it going to take? What do we have to do to put us in a nuclear reactor today? I mean, what are the next steps that we need as a state to get us down this road?
Right. So I'm talking about the state level and not the federal level. But at the state level, I think that an important step is to make the state open and available for developers. So for example, in Oklahoma, and I've been talking with those folks quite a bit there, they have two bills pending, SB 130 and HB 1375. The bill is for a feasibility and development study. It will go through the state. It'll identify what regulations should be changed, what statutes should be changed, where are the best sites, what's the best technology for each site, because there's some technologies that don't require water. They can be air-cooled. And so with that, it would be a public document that everybody could look at as opposed to something that just the utility did. And then that would be an invitation for developers. It would essentially do the developers' homework for them for that first step, and then they could come in and take a closer look at the state. That'd be my recommendation. There's also additional items. It's in the packet whenever I published the executive summary from the Texas. Texas is way ahead in this arena, but Texas has gone so far as to have recommendations for a nuclear authority, permitting, a single permitting point of contact officer. They've done some things to essentially guarantee, not subsidize, but stand behind the loans to lower the initial capital cost. I think it's too early for Kansas to do that. I do think that a development siting study would be appropriate.
Okay. Senator Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your service. By the way, I couldn't have done the submarines. I was on a carrier where we could see the light of day.
For what it's worth, Senator, I initially thought that when they gave me the tour of the sub, and I thought, this is really very cramped. I don't know if I can do this. And the recruiter said, you know, you get paid more if you're on subs.
Yes.
I thought, well, yeah, maybe I can get used to this.
I still liked seeing the light of day. I did. Long thought that nuclear was the solution, but again, the big impediment federally is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, all the regulations. Where do you see this going with this new administration? I asked this the other day and knew this was coming up, so I wanted to kind of get your take on it.
I'm very optimistic about the Department of Energy's new Secretary, Chris Wright. I met that gentleman, I believe he was at ALEC, is where I met him. I know that he's a board member of Oklo, which is one of the microreactor vendors. He may have divested, I don't know. It's not just DOE, although that's part of the solution, but it's also the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Nuclear is a bipartisan issue on Capitol Hill. It's one of the only ones there. My joke is, and it's funny because it's true, but like hating on Ticketmaster and being pro-nuclear are about the only two bipartisan issues that are out there. And so there is some movement with the statutes that Congress is putting out to have the NRC be more responsive. And when I talk to NRC leadership, the leadership itself is more responsive, and particularly the commissioners. I do think that there needs to be some work getting that message down to the individual contributors.
Are there any, sorry, just quickly, are there any impediments in the EPA at all with nuclear?
No, sir.
Okay, I didn't think so.
Not in my opinion. Most, no. That's a practical matter, no.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions? One that I might throw in here, Brian, this Abilene Christian University is building a new reactor. Do you know what the size of that is and estimated cost?
I know that the size is small, and I know that it's a research reactor, and I'm going to guess on the cost. It's an estimated guess, but it's probably about $1 billion.
Billion.
Plus or minus half. That's a guess, though, Chairman.
The Terra Power is building a new reactor in Wyoming. So that was, I heard about that a year ago. Bill Gates is behind that.
Right.
I just wonder what the status of that is. Do you have any idea when that's supposed to be up and running?
So my understanding is that they have the construction permit, and so they have begun construction, and they are proceeding forward on that. I know that Bill Gates delayed going forward on that project for a while until he could firm up the fuel source. But now that he's going forward, I'm assuming that the fuel source has been, that supply chain component has been there. But they're going forward with that. They've also got, Kairos Power has got its construction permitted and is going forward in eastern Tennessee. And then X Energy is down in Texas with Dow Chemical.
So 3 Mile Island's my understanding that they're getting ready to fire that back up.
Right, the one that did not melt down.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, they are. They're going to fire that one back up. You know, it's interesting on that. One of the issues is behind the meter. Like, is that electricity asset allowed to give all of its electricity, or preferentially the electricity, to the data center? And there's some federal rules on that. That's one of the policy things that are going to have to be worked out in the future with nuclear.
Okay. Any other questions, committee? Okay.
All right.
Mr. Meadows, thank you very much for coming up here and spending a little time with us, and we'll take your material, and thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, committee, do we have any other announcements from the committee at this point that you guys can think of? Senate Bill 11, we probably won't be working, and I got a letter on that, but I got the group together, and I think we got a great plan that everybody was happy with. So I get a copy of that letter, I'll give it to you guys, put in your file. So we're all headed in the right direction on that, I hope. So if there's not anything else, meeting adjourned.